Hello, hello, my guns and butter true crime family. Welcome back to the dinner table. Now, I hope everybody had a marvelous week and you were eagerly waiting to hear part two of Samuel Little's story. So I'm not going to keep you waiting any longer. Let's go ahead and get right into it.
That's what it's all about. Guns and butter, baby.
Now, I know the people we discuss here at the dinner table aren't the only ones who fly off the rails and lose their tempers, diving headfirst into a murder charge. If you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of uncontrollable emotions and you just can't get a grip, then let the sponsor of this episode, BetterHelp, help you. BetterHelp will connect you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen to all your intrusive thoughts and give you helpful, unbiased advice to keep you stable. It could all be so simple. Use the link listed in my show notes using the promo code KINDAG and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Get matched with the therapist selected just for you, usually in as little as just 48 hours. You can have your therapist right at your fingertips using your phone or computer, a phone call, video chat, and even messaging, whichever you prefer. Use the link in my show notes and get 10% off your first month of therapy right from the comfort of your home. So last week when we left off, I told y'all that Samuel Little was convicted and sentenced for killing 3 women, Audrey Nelson, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Carol Alfred. Now, while he was convicted and sentenced for those murders, investigators were also looking into him in relation to another murder, and that was of Denise Brothers out of Odessa, Texas. So while they were looking for evidence to connect him to that murder, they found 2 other murders that fit his MO. One was in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and it was the murder of Melinda Lepre. And another was in Gainesville, Florida, of Patricia Mount, and both occurred in 1982. One early Sunday morning around 9 a.m. on September 12, 1982, Little being around 42 at this time, a deceased woman's body was found in a hayfield outside of Gainesville, Florida. Her body was completely nude, but her clothes were disposed right next to her body. And oddly enough, investigators find feces all over her clothes and on parts of her body as well. And on her neck, she had bruising and gouges indicative of fingernail markings, almost as if she was trying to pry from someone's grasp around her neck. So, some Florida investigators on the scene assumed that she was most likely strangled. And one of the officers on the scene actually recognized the woman as 26-year-old Patricia Mount. Now, it was said that Patricia had an IQ of about 40, which, if you look at an IQ chart, that's mentally disabled. And she had a history of talking to anybody that would buy her a drink, get her some beer. In fact, she was arrested only 2 nights before her body was found for being drunk and disorderly. Now, the day before her body was discovered, witnesses saw her at a local bar called Willie Mae Hodges Beer Tavern. Now, she was clearly intoxicated, and she was hanging around with the stranger who she eventually left with that night. Now, that night in September of 1982, Little was back in Florida, and he was on the prowl for his next victim. The night Patricia Mount went missing, 44-year-old Irene Moth, who was a hotel laundry room employee at the time, was sitting on the hood of her car on the side of the street in Gainesville. She says Little pulled up alongside of her and asked her if she wanted to have a drink with him. Although she declined his offer, when he turned and asked what was going on down the street, she gladly told him it was the local bar called Willie Mae Hodges and suggested that he go check it out. So Little leaves Irene sitting on the hood of her car and heads down the street to see what's going on in town at this bar. While at the bar, Little was trying all night to get women to drink and dance with him, and nobody was really feeling his vibe. Until he spots a tall, intoxicated woman swaying on the dance floor, and this woman being Patricia Mount. So like I just mentioned, Patricia had an IQ of about 40. So on top of her being heavily intoxicated, she also wasn't the brightest crayon in the crayon box, making her a perfect target for Little. And after being turned down by women left and right that night, He was determined to feel and squeeze on Patricia's neck that night. So Patricia was vulnerable, and like I just mentioned, she was going to hang around you as long as you was buying her drinks and beer, and that's exactly what Little did that night. They danced the night away and he loaded her up with drinks until she agreed to leave with him. So after he got her drunk as a skunk, loose as a goose, he walks her back to his car and they leave. And oddly enough, the same person that pointed him in the direction of the bar that night, Irene Moths, also saw them leaving the bar together. So once in his car, he drives her about 20 miles away to a rural forest grove. He strangles and rapes her and leaves her body in a hayfield, nude and covered in bruises, feces, and deep scratches around her neck. By the time her body was discovered the next morning, Little had already fled to his next destination. And all witnesses describe the same man Patricia left with that night. He was black, medium height, heavy set with facial hair, was driving a small station wagon with wood grain sides, and it had a loud muffler. So Florida PD quickly puts out a bolo for this car. It wasn't until December of 1982 when Florida agencies get a call from Pascagoula, Mississippi, informing them that they had a suspect in custody who was driving the vehicle described in their bolo. You see what I'm talking about? This man moves so dang fast. He was in Florida one day and then Mississippi the next, still committing crimes nonetheless. So after dumping Patricia Mount's body, he shoots over to Mississippi. Dude gets no sleep because he was still on the prowl for another victim. So while in Mississippi, he comes across 22-year-old Melinda LaPree standing outside of a laundromat. So Melinda, who went by Mindy, was actually from a small town in New Hampshire. And she had a pretty rough home life after her mother passed away when she was only 7 years old in 1967. Her mother passed away from complications after delivering her fifth child. And her father, who was around 45 at the time and now a new widow, was left to raise 5 children on his own. But her father had a short fuse. And growing up, Mindy was a very adventurous and rebellious child. But this caused for a lot of friction between she and her dad. And he didn't take too kindly to her backtalk and her teenage attitude. So he would beat her and drag her around the house whenever she would get out of hand. And the older she got, the worse she became. She was sneaking out of the house, dating older guys, drinking, and experimenting with drugs. And by the time she was 12 years old, her family says she was full-blown addicted to cocaine and marijuana. And by the time she got to high school, doing drugs was Mindy's norm. But luckily, she was a straight-A student and she was able to graduate a year early. And she wasted no time leaving New Hampshire, heading straight towards the south. And she found herself working pretty much wherever she could. She was even a bouncer at a bar at a point in time. But against the family's wishes, Mindy just did not want to return home to New Hampshire. And by 1982, she found herself living in Pascagoula, Mississippi with a man named Bill. And on August 25th of 1982, Mindy gave birth to a baby boy named Will. And a couple weeks after giving birth to her son Will, it's about Labor Day at this time. Bill calls Mindy's father, informing him that his daughter Mindy was missing. Now, Mindy was only 22 years old, but she had already started working the corners, and she had to now support her son and her drug habit. So the night she went missing, a couple of girls seen her get into a car with the man, and that was the last time they seen her. Weeks later, on October 4th, a groundskeeper at a cemetery starts smelling that fragrant odor of death. While he's cutting the grass, he comes across a body. The body was found laying in a bed of dead flowers. The body was so badly decomposed, investigators couldn't tell if it was a male or a female. But luckily, the body was identified as Melinda LaPree's due to a leg fracture she had earlier in life. Her cause of death was determined to be strangulation. And this determination was made because her hyoid bone was completely dislodged. Now, a witness eventually came forward and lets investigators know that Mindy was seen getting into a small station wagon with wood grain side panels with Alabama plates. The witness also describes the driver of this vehicle as a black man with a stocky build. And y'all, let's not forget that murder is not the only crime that Little is known to do. He was a shoplifter, a thief, armed robber, all of the above. So thankfully, investigators hear another call where someone was arrested for shoplifting. And the car they were driving was a brown station wagon with wood grain sides and Alabama tags. So at this time, Little was arrested in Pascagoula, Mississippi. So Little's arrest in Mississippi leads detectives to his connection to Patricia Mount's murder in Gainesville, Florida. So the man they arrested went by Samuel McDowell, of course. So Florida investigators head down to Mississippi with the hopes of speaking to him and maybe getting a confession out of him for Patricia Mount's murder. But Sam wasn't dumb, and he knew they had no hardcore evidence, so he played their game. And at first, when they started questioning him, he denied being in Gainesville. But after further questioning, he admitted to being there at the bar, but of course he doesn't admit to leaving with anyone. But by this time, they had tracked down his day one, his ace boon coup, Aurelia Dorsey, in a nearby motel. But y'all already know she covered for her man. She told them that he would never hurt anyone, and he was a good guy. But Aurelia wasn't the only person who they found in the motel that night. They also found a young man by the name of Danny. You see, Little and Aurelia picked him up while they were on one of their road trips through Arkansas. And unlike Miss Dorsey, he was talking. He says the night Patricia Mount went missing, Sam wasn't in the hotel with him and Miss Dorsey. And Danny goes on to tell detectives that Sam left out the motel early on September 11th, and he didn't return until daybreak of September 12th. And Patricia's body was discovered around 9 a.m. that same morning. Danny goes on to tell investigators that there was something that smelled god-awful terrible in the backseat of the car. So it was said that while Little was strangling Patricia, she defecated on herself. And that's why she was covered in feces when she was discovered. And then Danny tells detectives that there was something that smelled terrible in the backseat of the car. I mean, let's put two and two together. So during Danny's questioning, investigators ask him, "So who cleaned the car?" And he replies, quote, "Miss Dorsey. Every morning she would get up when he came in, and she would go out there with a bucket of disinfectant and clean the car." So this leads me to ask the question, did Miss Dorsey know what he was doing every time he left her? Or did she just play dumb because she was scared of him herself? Because as a woman, there's no way that your man, is going to leave you every day, come back home smelling crazy, looking crazy, car messed up, and you're just completely oblivious to what he's doing. But yet you're sitting in trial after trial, covering for him. I think she knew. She definitely knew. Okay, back to the story. So as Pascagoula is building their case against Little, a new witness comes forward claiming she's seen Little drop Mindy off at her motel just hours before she was killed. So now this brings reasonable doubt into question, and they have to ask themselves, if a witness seen him drop her off at the motel, was he really the last person that seen her alive? Did he do it? And when the case was submitted to the DA's office, the DA didn't believe that they had enough to charge him with murder. And because they didn't have enough to charge him, they had to release him. So Mississippi released him back to Florida. And again, this is another reason why he was able to get away with these murders for so long. Everybody had the right suspect. It was the right guy. But they didn't have enough evidence to charge him, so he would just skate by every single time. Now back in Pascagoula, they felt like they had more evidence to get a conviction. They had a witness from the bar who ID'd Little as the man who Patricia left with. They also had the car that matched the description. They had the feces found on Patricia's body in Little's car. And they found a strand of Little's hair on Patricia's body. So just when Florida felt like they had enough evidence and enough witnesses to get a solid conviction, in the spring of 1983, just before Patricia Mount's trial begins, their star witness Danny disappears. And after postponing the trial 2 times, they had no choice but to continue on without Danny's testimony. And Florida's prosecution came with some pretty damning evidence. But Little's defense put up a good fight as well. And in regards to the hair being found on Patricia's body, his defense argued that this happened while they were on the dance floor at the bar that night. They were having a good time. And even with all the evidence that Florida presented against Little, it only took a jury 30 minutes to find him not guilty. And within 2 hours, he was back on the streets. Now, 35 years after Denise Brothers was murdered, on May 17, 2018, Palazzolo, Williamson, and Holland are finally able to speak with Little, with the hopes of getting a confession for her murder. So, knowing that Little hated the LAPD, the team used that as their icebreaker, their way in while speaking to him. And even though their hopes were high, they had no idea how he would react to being questioned. They didn't know if he would shut down. They didn't know if he would spaz out. They didn't know. This man is a whole serial killer. So with that being said, the two female investigators, Williamson and Palazzolo, sat outside the interrogation room watching over the video feed while Holland goes in to question him. So after having small talk with Little, nothing too serious, he didn't go in and dive right into questioning him about murders. He tried to build his trust at first. And after some time, Little started to open up, and Holland steers him towards the case that he really was there to talk about. So he asks him a simple question. Have you ever been to Odessa? And when asked this simple question about Odessa, Little shockingly opens up to Holland. And he mentions something about being in Odessa and something about a white girl. And then Jim asks him to describe the white girl. And he says, I think her hair was blonde. She was skinny, tall, maybe about 35, 40 years old. And then Holland asks him where he put her body. And Little answers back by saying there was a fence. And then he describes what Denise was wearing, her body positioning, and the crime scene. So at the time, neither Holland or Little had mentioned Denise's name. But the way he was describing the crime scene, they knew exactly who he was talking about. And then after briefly brushing over Denise's case, Little surprisingly moves on to talking about another victim. He goes on to mention a heavyset black woman with a yellow complexion. Then from there, he goes on to talk about how he met another woman from Houston and he dumped her body in Alabama. He describes this woman as being named Nancy. And then he goes on to talk about traveling through Huntsville, Alabama through Decatur. Now, he says he doesn't remember Nancy's last name, but after going through many case files, the team comes across the death of a woman by the name of Nancy Stevens. Nancy was born March 31st, 1959. Now, something interesting about her is that she was from Decatur, and she died around August 8th, 2005. So this draws investigators to look back into their case files. And in the summer of 2005, investigators were hit with an over-the-border case in Mississippi. See, Nancy's body was found 3 miles from Tupelo, Mississippi, and she too died from manual strangulation. 2 men riding on motorcycles found her body dumped along the side of the road. Like many of Little's other victims, Nancy had fallen on hard times. After graduating from high school, she went on to attend Calhoun Community College. Well, that was until she got pregnant, and then she eventually dropped out of school. With the responsibility of having to care for her newborn son, she dropped out of college and started working an assembly line job at General Motors. It was at this time when Nancy started to experiment with drugs, and she unfortunately got addicted to crack. From then on out, she started to hop in cars and take trips with random people. And in August of 2005, Nancy decided to go on a trip with an unknown man, and this would be the last time that her family seen her alive. During the interview with Holland, Little describes driving with Nancy to a place in Mississippi and staying in one of Elvis Presley's houses in Tupelo. Now, Nancy's murder occurred in 2005, which means that she was Little's last victim. So while interviewing Little, the team discovers something else interesting about him. They discover that he's actually a pretty decent artist. And low-key, he could have had a pretty decent career in art if he didn't pick other career paths to go down. Yeah. So at this time, when they find out that Little can draw, they wanted to capitalize on his talents. While Little was going down his roster of victims, Holland and the team had no idea which victim he was talking about, what the woman looked like, her name, and Little had no idea who the victim was either. These were prostitutes. He just picked them up on the side of the road and killed them, essentially. Not only that, they only came to talk to Little to get his confession for Denise Brothers' case. So the fact that he was going in detail on these other women's cases, they're like, what? We only brought enough pen and paper to write down the confession for one murder. There's more? Hold on. What? So Holland went off on a whim and he asked him how well he remembered what his victims looked like and if he'd be willing to draw them from memory if given the supplies and a small art studio, in the prison, of course. And surprisingly, Little was pretty cooperative. He agreed to draw the women as he remembered them. But I kid you not, this man could draw his victim's face from memory. By the end of the first day interviewing Little, he'd taken Holland down memory lane to all the cities and states that he had visited, and he'd called out the number of women that he'd killed in each place. He recalls his first kill being in Miami, Florida. He says he took 16 lives there. Gulfport, Mississippi, 5. Jackson, Mississippi, 3. Arkansas, 1. Memphis, 1. Chattanooga, 1. Knoxville, 2. Kentucky, Bowling Green, 1. Then he moved on across the Ohio River to Columbus and killed 1 there. Akron, Ohio, 1. Cleveland, Ohio, 3. Indiana, 2. East St. Louis, 1. Omaha, Nebraska, 1. Phoenix, 3. Nevada, 1. Las Vegas, 1. LA, 20. The list just went on and on, overall totaling to 90 victims. During the interview, Holland asked Little if he remembers the year in which he killed his first victim, and Little answers 1970. So this man started killing women when he was 30 years old, and his last death was when he was 65. Ain't no way. Ain't no fucking way. By the time this interview was being conducted in 2018, Little was about 78 years old, so he was old as hell. And not only that, but Little had diabetes, heart problems, he had a whole bunch of health issues. And the team didn't know how much longer he had to live. So they wanted to keep him talking for as long as possible because they didn't want him to take these secrets with him to the grave. So with that being said, Holland promises Little that he would get the death penalty waived if he confessed to killing Denise Brothers. Now, I know how that could sound. It may sound like they're trying to coerce a confession out of this man just to close a cold case. But with all of the evidence and the timelines matching up, they knew they had the right man. But they wanted him to confess to the crime without being coached in any way, form, or fashion. So that means they had to keep him talking. By the start of the second day, Jim Holland had come through on his promise for Little, and he brought him a written statement saying that he was off the hook for the death penalty in exchange for a plea of guilty and life in prison. So he was pretty much free to speak, seeing as how he was already serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Now, seeing as how Denise's murder occurred in Odessa, Little agrees to be extradited back to Texas. But the DA still needed more evidence to prove that he was the one that actually killed Denise. So Little begins to dig through his treasure box of memories, taking a stroll down memory lane. At this time, he describes he and Denise's first and only encounter, way back in 1994. He recalls it being not too long after New Year's. He says they were sitting in his car, she was in the front seat smoking a pipe, and then he started feeling on her neck. And she instinctively tells him, "Don't choke me." And then he somehow got her into the back seat. They started wrestling, and then she, quote, lost the battle. All of his stories about the women he encountered were very matter of fact. It was like, and then she died. Yep. When asked what Little did with Denise's body, he says he took her out of the car and laid her by a fence. And there was a steel or iron rail that he describes being there as well. So after hearing this detail about the steel rail, The team wants to confirm Little's facts. So they go through a not yet developed crime scene photo, and investigators are able to confirm that there was a 35 millimeter steel rod in one of the crime scene photos. None of this information was ever released to the public, and this man is 78 years old, so the fact that he's able to recall this being there just sealed the deal to his confession. After confessing to Denise Brothers' murder, the team was finally able to close her case after all these years. And by the end of day 2, Little had given the team specific details from about 20 other cold cases. And Little promised if extradited to Texas, he would continue talking, giving the team the opportunity to get information on possibly 70 more cases. So do the math. 70 plus 20, he was already convicted on 3. And you know what's crazy? Even at his old, sick age, he hadn't forgotten any of his victims. Now, let's not get that misconstrued. He didn't always remember his victims' names, but he did remember specific details about their encounter and small details like what necklace they were wearing, what their smile looked like, and even the style they had their hair in. Now, along with not always remembering their names, he also wasn't too good with time frames and what exact year events happened. Another thing he wasn't too keen on was jurisdictional lines. For example, he would pick a victim up in Alabama, drive them around state to state, and then dump them alongside of the road, and they would be found in a whole nother state's jurisdiction. But in some cases, he recalled news headlines where he remembered key details from the case. He remembered in one woman's murder, she was headlined in the newspaper as Lost Soul. Now, this woman who he recalls on this occasion was, of course, a prostitute, and he describes her as being a little slow in the head. And after doing some digging, the team finds out that this woman was originally from Indiana, but she was killed in Florida. And this victim was 25-year-old Angela Chapman. She was strangled by Little in 1976. In another case, he recalls disposing of a woman's body somewhere near some weird arches in a driveway of someone's home. So they start digging through their files to figure out who this woman could be. Then, the team finds a woman who was murdered and dumped near these weird arches in somebody's driveway. And crazy that this man spoke these words out of his little leather lips. Up until the day he died, he was convinced that if his victims were still alive, they would have no ill will against him, and he considered all of them friends. During one of the interviews, he says, quote, "They didn't die mad at me. They didn't curse me and call me every name in the book. They was my friend. We didn't have no misunderstanding. I didn't hate them, and they didn't hate me." End quote. So after interviewing and speaking with Little for a couple days at this point, the team wants to know why he killed so many women, why he targeted the women he targeted. And he can remember from the age of 5 being sexually attracted to a woman's neck. Now, he himself couldn't really put in words and describe why he had such an obsession with the woman's neck, but he remembers being around 7 or 8 and having his first thoughts of wanting to kill someone. Like, what? That's wild. 7? And at the age of 15, he remembers this being the age where he started being interested in true crime. And while reading his true crime magazine, he recalls seeing a picture of a woman named Gloria Ferry. She was strangled by a wrestler by the name of Louis Statler. Just before she was about to testify against him, he killed her and dumped her body in a suburban part of Cleveland, Ohio. Little says he remembers Gloria's neck being so beautiful to him. And he recalls this story as being his inspiration for why he enjoyed strangling women so much. So not only was this true crime magazine something that he enjoyed reading, it also taught him how to get away with murder in a sense. You see, as a child, he spent time reading the detective magazines and studying and learning what detectives looked for at crime scenes or what they would do at the crime scenes. So he knew from an early age about fingerprints and hair fibers and what not to leave behind at a crime scene. But finally, at the age of 30, Little was tired of fantasizing about a woman's neck. He wanted more. And that's when he committed his first murder. So if y'all remember, this man is 78. So investigators want to know how he was able to move around so freely all those years. And when asked about the closest encounter he ever had to being caught by the police, Little recalls a time in Ocala, Florida in 1982. 1982 was a busy year for this man. He was out there ruthless. So he says he was passing through the small town of Ocala, Florida around August 12th with one of his dates, a woman by the name of Rosie Hill. He then drives her to a deserted spot behind a factory. He pinned her down with all of his weight and then started choking and strangling the life out of her. But then, out of nowhere, the cops pulled up behind him with their lights on. And just like the night he assaulted Tanya Jackson in San Diego, only 2 years later, he does the same thing here, only this time it actually works. He jumps out the car, pulls his pants up, starts zipping up his zipper. He tells the cop he and his wife are back there having sex. And when the cop shines a light in the back seat and sees a nude woman laying back there, he's pretty much like, whoa, I don't want to see that, and tells Little to get out of there. And while Little is recalling all of these stories with the women he encountered and murdered, it's a mix between him reminiscing with the good old days of his younger times and arousal. Like he would touch himself and get excited about these women all over again. Another body investigators were able to put a name to was found July 3rd, 1984 in Cleveland, Ohio. Her remains were discovered in an industrial part of town. Workers seen body fluids coming from underneath the door into the basement of a manufacturing plant. Her body was found at the bottom of a stairwell, and it was concluded that she had most likely been there for a month or two. The victim's name was Mary Jo Payton. When asked about Mary Jo, Little says he found her at a local bar and he lured her to his car with the promise of getting her more alcohol. In 1991, another case pops up in Cleveland, Ohio. Little recalls a woman who was skinny, had dark hair, and she was wearing blue jeans. He says he left her body in a field and covered it with tires. And luckily her body was found almost immediately, so they were able to determine that she was in fact strangled. This woman's name was Rose Evans. She was from Bennington, New York, but she moved to Cleveland with big dreams. Now, I don't know why she moved to Cleveland with these big dreams, but unfortunately, along her journey, she got addicted to drugs. In Rose's case, Little recalls driving a big van during this time, and he remembers being in the back of the van trying to get Rose to come in the back with him. And she kept telling him, no, I'm not going to get in the back with you because I know you're going to kill me. And little did she know, that's exactly what he was going to do. This man seriously had no regard for women. He didn't care what they looked like. He didn't care if they were mentally ill. He didn't care if they had kids and a family. The only thing he cared about was getting his rocks off and fulfilling some sick, nasty fantasy that he always had. In another occasion where he doesn't remember exactly the time frame, it was sometime between 1977 and 1979. He says he picked up a black female who was skinny, about 20 years old. He remembers she was wearing a dress and how he disposed of her body after he killed her. He dumped her on a highway between Cleveland and Akron. And unfortunately, Cleveland investigators were never able to locate this case or this woman. And along with Melinda Lepre in Pascagoula, Mississippi, there was a Jane Doe, possibly killed around 1977. Like, there's no way to keep track of how many women he killed, their names, when he did it. This is just sickening. Now, to hit on Melinda Lepre one last time, he gives his take of what happened the night she was murdered. So remember in her case when Mississippi was trying to build their case against him, but they didn't have enough evidence because a sex worker came forward saying that she seen Melinda getting dropped off at her motel that night? So 36 years later, listen to what Little says actually happened that night. So he did in fact drop her off at her motel that night. That was just a front though. He had instructed her to go into her motel and then meet him around back so that nobody would see her leave. We're almost done, cousins. I'm sick of talking about this man too. In one of Little's last confessions, he describes what happened to Patricia Mount. He says he met her at the local bar. They were sitting on the stool. She was with one of her girlfriends, but she kept bugging him. She wouldn't leave him alone all night. Now, he says he wasn't exactly sexually attracted to her. And he wasn't looking at her body or her face. He had his eyes on her neck all night, and he was fighting back the urge to strangle her. He was so excited while looking at her throat. So when he finally got her alone in his car, he drove her around for a while before parking in a hayfield. He pulled up, cut the lights out, and they stayed in the front seat, chatted for a minute or two, and then she let him feel her throat. And before he knew it, he had his hands tightened around her neck. Now, when it was all said and done, he admitted to strangling a good 93 women. And he didn't discriminate. He didn't care about age, race, height, weight. If your neck looked good to him, you were always going to be his perfect target. And learning that his mother was a prostitute and she abandoned him, it made sense that those were the type of women that he targeted. It was almost as if he had some sort of like mommy complex, or he wanted to have control over the type of woman who caused him the most pain. But every single one of his crimes was sexually motivated and purely for his own enjoyment. Now, that's pretty much a wrap on this week's case. I don't want to talk about this Eminem body built ass man anymore. Now, y'all, I know that was a lot of
That's what it's all
information,
about.
but I
Guns
hope
and
you
butter,
guys
baby.
enjoyed my very first serial killer little mini series. And as usual, I'll see you guys back here, same place, same time next week.